their lives. He tried to tell them about it before it happened, but they wouldn't listen to him. They thought he'd gone crank. And finally, in desperation, he destroyed the printing press. Now, of course, no such printing press has ever been invented, nor ever will be, because there's one thing that human beings can't do, and that is foretell the future. I mean, if we could tell the future, all we would have to do, the next horse race that takes place, all you'd need to do is put all your money on the horse that you know is going to win, and you could become a very rich person. Isn't that right? And it wouldn't seem to be very difficult to me if someone claims that they can read the future to be able to tell which horse is going to win next race. Because you haven't got to tell it a long way in advance, only, what, half an hour before the horse race. Or, if you don't like horse races, what about lotto? Pick 6 numbers and you could become a multi-millionaire. Now, once again, if you can read the future, if human beings can read the future, surely it shouldn't be very hard to do that. But the trouble is, nobody can do it. Now, every now and again, someone backs the right horse and they get the right numbers, but get them to do it the next week or the next week or the next week. Impossible. Because nobody can read the future. But I want to tell you this. God actually guarantees he can read the future. And he has written it down so that we today can read what was written thousands of years ago, and as it comes to pass before our eyes today, it gives us tremendous confidence that we're not following some made-up story or a fairy tale. And that written material, it's called prophecy, has actually been written in the Bible. Now, I know that there may be some of my friends here today who maybe have got some very sceptical views about the Bible. They wonder whether the Bible is true, whether it's just full of fairy stories. Story of Adam and Eve and all that, just a fairy story. Well, I want to assure you over this series of programs that I'm going to give you evidence that this book is indeed God's book. Matthew 16, it says, "Then the Pharisees and Sadducees came and testing him asked that he would show them a sign from heaven. He answered and said to them, when it is evening you say, it will be fair weather for the sky is red, and in the morning it will be foul weather today for the sky is red and threatening. Hypocrites, you know how to discern the face of the sky, but you cannot discern the signs of the times." Now, Jesus called these men hypocrites, that is the religious leaders of the day, because they could go out at night and they could see a red sky. And what does usually a red sky suggest when you see it in the evening? That shows it's going to be what? Good weather tomorrow. On the other hand, if you get up in the morning and you notice a red sky in the east, what does that usually suggest? Not so good. We have a saying, don't we? Shepherd's delight and a shepherd's warning. And these men were as good as the Weather Bureau. They knew what type of weather because they studied the signs in the sky, but they knew nothing about the signs of the times. And Jesus said that they ought to have understood the signs of the times. In fact, on one occasion, the disciples came to Jesus while he was on his own, separate from the crowds. It's recorded over here in Matthew 24. If you just come over a little further to Matthew 24. And they asked him the question because they had heard Jesus speak so often about the signs of the times that they got Jesus alone by themselves one day, and this is the question they put to him. Now, as he sat on the Mount of Olives, this is verse 3 down the bottom, see? The disciples came to him privately saying, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" And so the disciples wanted to know the answer to this question from Jesus. How will the world end? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the world? And it's interesting to notice what Jesus said. You would expect that him immediately to say, well, the first sign will be, and then to start listing them off. But he doesn't do that. Have a look at verse 4 as to what he says. Jesus answered and said to them, "Take heed that no one," what? Deceives you. So he starts with a warning, because he said there's going to be an awful lot of deception regarding my coming. Because there's going to be lots of people claiming to be this and claiming to be that. And what proportion of the population is the many? When it says they will deceive many, what proportion of the population would many be? Not all, would it? Many's not all. The majority, that's right, the majority. So it has to be at least 51%, isn't that right? To be the many. So at least we would say half the population is deceived regarding the coming of Jesus. At least. Many are going to be deceived. And he says here that they, as it says in verse 5, for many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. That's the vast majority. And so that's why when we go out to talk to people about the coming of Jesus, we have to recognise that the vast majority of people are deceived. They do not know. That's why we must go to the Bible to find out what Jesus said, not to ask this one or that one, because they may be amongst the group that are deceived. We must go to what Jesus said. And here in Matthew chapter 24, Jesus gives us 5 great signs that are going to take place before he returns. First of all, signs in the religious world. Then he talks about signs in the political world. Then he talks about signs in the natural world, signs in the economic world, and finally signs in the social world. Let's have a look first of all at the signs that he spoke about in the religious world. Verse 5. For many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ. Now when it says that they will come in my name, what does that mean? Does that mean that they are the atheists? They are the soothsayers and those dabbling in witchcraft? Is that what it's talking about? Not necessarily at all. It's talking about those who claim to be followers of Christ. That is, the religious world, the Christian world. They're the ones, Jesus said, to be very careful about, because in what they teach, they're going to deceive many, the vast majority. And so the very first thing that we notice about his coming is a warning. Be very careful, Jesus said. There's a lot of deception. And so that ought to put us on full alert as we study this subject, to be very, very careful in our study. And that's the reason why we've gone to the expense of giving you all a Bible, because I don't want you to go home from these meetings saying, well, that's what Jeff Yulden teaches, or that's Jeff Yulden's opinion. In all honesty, friends, what my opinion is, and with all due respect to you, what your opinion is, really in the bottom line doesn't count. Because the only opinion that really matters is what God says. And that's why we want you to see it with your own eyes. We want you to study this book. Because by the time this series finishes, I want you to feel that you're very comfortable with the Bible and that you're finding your way around it. And so Jesus said, be very, very careful. There's going to be a lot of deception regarding my coming. Then he began to talk about signs in the political world. Have a look at verse 6. Matthew 24, now verse 6. And you will hear of wars and rumours of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. When you say we've always had wars, absolutely. We have always had wars. Wars in themselves are not a sign of Christ's coming, because as we all admit, there's always been wars. While there's human nature and 2 human beings on the world, there's going to be wars and unrest and unhappiness. But what we are facing as we study the Bible is an increase of these signs as we get closer to the coming of Jesus. That's what we're going to notice. For example, let me give you some history. Historians estimate that up until the First World War, there have been about 900 major wars in the world. 900. But in the First World War, over 7 million men and women died. In fact, up until the First World War, there were 7 times more people killed in that war than historians estimate than all the human wars put together. 7 times. But Jesus said these things were only going to be but the beginning. That was followed by the Second World War. And since the Second World War, in which millions more died, we've hardly had a year of peace. And when we think of Korea and Vietnam and Cambodia and Afghanistan and Ethiopia and Angola and Lebanon and Iraq and Kurdistan and Armenia, Nicaragua and El Salvador, Burundi, Bosnia, Angola, and the list goes on and on and on, and will continue to go on and on and on. And we're going to see an intensification of these things the closer we get to the coming of Jesus. That's what Jesus was talking about here. In fact, if you come over to the book of Luke now, the 21st chapter, now Luke is recording exactly the same sermon that Jesus preached that's recorded in Matthew 24. You understand that Matthew, Mark, Luke and John really are covering the same history that was regarding the life of Jesus. And so there are some similarities between Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. Now Luke 21 is Luke's recording of the same sermon that Matthew recorded in Matthew chapter 24, only that Luke gives some aspects that Matthew didn't. And Matthew gives some things that Luke didn't. And you'd expect that with eyewitnesses because we all have a different perspective. We may see the same event, but we will describe it a little differently. Isn't that right? And so you find some slight differences that help to round out the full picture. And here in Luke chapter 21 and verse 25, Jesus also added in that same sermon, there will be signs in the sun, in the moon, and in the stars. And on the earth, distress of nations with perplexity. Now, what does that mean? What does it mean that the nations would be perplexed? Well, let me illustrate. Say you're going home from this meeting this afternoon, and as you rounded your street corner, suddenly you see your house going up in flames. The feelings that would come over you at that stage, that's how the Bible describes it, as being perplexed. There's just no way of resolving the problem. And Jesus said here, the nations will be perplexed. For example, let's consider for a moment the Middle East. How are you going to solve the problem between the Jews and the Arabs? You know, I've been in the Middle East many, many times. I've spoken to both Arabs and Jews. And I want to tell you this, that when you speak to the Arabs, you feel that they have a watertight case. When you speak to the Jews, you feel that they've got a watertight case. And when in 1948 this line was drawn, and if you happened to be on the wrong side, and if you were Arab, you had to leave your farm that had been in your family for hundreds and hundreds of years and get over to the other side. And when you got over to the other side, they didn't provide you with a nice alternate farm. They put you into camps. And many of those families have been living in those camps ever since 1948. And you can imagine the feelings that are in those people's hearts. You imagine a pair of thugs came in and took you out, pushed you out of your house, and then put you in some camp with hardly running water and so forth. You wouldn't feel too, magnanimous toward them, would you? Now, I'm not excusing the Arabs, but I want to tell you that many of the suicide bombers, that's where they come from these camps. Because they've got nothing to live for, and the hatred that has been built up in their hearts, the resentment against the interference that's taken place in those countries, and particularly against the Jews, is something which is very hard to describe, but it goes so deep. And they live for one thing and one thing only, and that is to drive every Jew into the Mediterranean Sea. That's what they live for. And if they die in the process, so be it. But as long as they can advance the cause that they're joining, how are you going to solve that? I don't know, and I don't know any other political leader that has any idea how to solve it. And that's why Jesus said the nations will be absolutely perplexed as they see what's happening in the world. In fact, notice the next verse, verse 26. Men's hearts failing them from fear and the expectation of those things which are coming on the earth. The more people know of what's happening in the world, and the more educated you are today, the more widely you are read, and the more exposed you are to what's happening in the world, the more fear comes into your heart. Because when the Soviet Union, for example, was broken up, some of the nuclear weapons that the Soviet Union had have gone missing. And world leaders still don't know where they all are. Many believe today that there's a high probability that some of those may be in the hands of a terrorist organisation. Now you imagine if that is true. Imagine if Osama bin Laden had in his hands the possibility of exploding a nuclear weapon. And not only are we fearful today about terrorism, of course, that's only one thing. What about now the possibility of the tsunamis? And I'll tell you, most of us in Australia and around the world think that the most ideal place to live is on the water. And we all thought that Australia was going to be pretty well protected from tsunamis until very recently one hit up there in the Solomon Islands, and they all got panicked all down the eastern coast of Australia, right down to Sydney. And they were on high alert for a great tsunami or tidal wave coming in. And the Bible is saying here that men's hearts are going to fail them from fear in the expectation of those things which are coming on the earth. And I believe the more, as days and weeks and the years roll by, we are beginning to see more understanding of this verse than we've ever understood in the past. And Jesus said here, be very, very watchful. Signs in the political world. And sometimes people say to me, well, Jeff, does the Bible say anything about nuclear war? Well, just come over to Revelation chapter 11 and verse 18. Revelation chapter 11 and verse 18. It's page 1182 at the back of the Bible. 1182. And verse 18 is halfway down the outside column. And this is what it says. Revelation chapter 11 and verse 18. The nations were angry. Your wrath has come. And the time of the dead, that they should be judged, and that you should reward your servants, the prophets and the saints, and those who fear your name, small and great, and should destroy those who what? Destroy the earth. I'm going to suggest to every person that it's only the generation that has lived since the Second World War that has had the possibility of destroying this earth. We have got the possibility now with the bomb and, of course, more recently with pollution. And the Bible says that God is going to destroy those who attempt to destroy the earth. And once again, this is just another sign that Jesus is coming and coming soon. And I want to assure you of this, that this world has cost God far, far too much, that he's going to allow some terrorist organisation or some person here or there to destroy the earth. God is going to write the last sentence on the earth. And he's going to write it when he comes back the second time. But that doesn't mean that in between now and then that there's going to be not some great turmoil. And men's hearts are going to fail them from fear in the expectation of those things which are coming on the earth. Let's go back to Matthew 24, because Jesus now talks about signs in the physical world or the natural world. Come back to Matthew chapter 24. Matthew chapter 24 and verse 7. And this is what it says, Matthew 24 and verse 7. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. Then it says, and there shall be what? Famines. Yes, pestilences and earthquakes in various places. Now, look, I don't have to prove tonight or today what I'm going to share with you, because you know it as well as I. You watch the news, you're intelligent, you see what's going on in the world. All I'm doing today is I want to point out that the Bible was written 2,000 years ago. At least this part of the Bible was written 2,000 years ago. And what gives me tremendous confidence is, as we see these very events happening before our eyes today, it gives us confidence that we're not following a fairy tale. Get the thought? And so Jesus mentions pestilences. Now, what are pestilences? Well, I guess here in Australia we call them pests. You know, we like to shorten everything. Pests. Now, the amazing thing is this, that while all the amazing discoveries have been made in the medical world, it seems that the germs and the bugs are always one step ahead of us. And it seems to me that while the doctors have been going to college, the bugs and the pests have been going to university, because they always seem to be just that much further ahead, don't they? And Jesus mentioned pestilences, and those of us who come from a farming background realise today that we are spraying for things that we never had to spray for in the past. And the tragic thing is today is that the very things that mankind has discovered in the last 100 years, I'm thinking of things like penicillin, that have been there to protect us, these very things, because many of these antibiotics have been overprescribed, now the human organism is building up an immunity against it, and so the very things that were once there to save us are no longer providing that strong barrier. And Jesus mentioned pestilences. I picked up a book recently written by Laurie Garrett, that's a lady, and she maintains that in the world today there are superbugs. She wrote the book, the title of the book is The Coming Plague. And she talks about HIV and Ebola and Marburg and the virus that killed that horse trainer up in Queensland a number of years ago, which they still haven't worked out what killed him and the horses. It's a mystery. And she's been writing all this up, and she's saying that the viruses and so forth that are starting to break out in the world now are due to the transmission of disease because of aeroplane travel. You know, disease can be taken from one part of the world to the other in a very short amount of time, and the sexual revolution. And once again, if Jesus doesn't come soon, the very things that we felt secure about could destroy us again. And then Jesus mentioned, after famines and then pestilences, he mentioned earthquakes in various places. Now, once again, I don't have to remind you about earthquakes. And while it's true that we have always had earthquakes, nobody is suggesting that earthquakes are a phenomena of the 20th and 21st century. Not at all. There have been major earthquakes in the past, but let me tell you, very few. If you pick up the internet or the encyclopedia, you check back through under the subject of earthquakes, and you will be surprised at the intensity of the number of earthquakes that are taking place in the world now. They believe over 6,000 every year. Fortunately, all of them aren't number 6 on the Richter scale and above. Otherwise, the world would be really in a mess. But we are seeing sufficient of those earthquakes to realise that there is an increase in the intensity. And that tsunami that killed, over 300,000 people in Asia, that is nothing more or less than an earthquake, isn't it? That's what it is. Only it's an earthquake underneath the sea. And that's why we have no control. And no country really is immune from the possibilities. of being wiped out. We've already seen New Orleans. And that ought to give us a clue as to what can happen. And who knows what's going to happen in the future, but Jesus mentioned earthquakes along with famines and along with pestilences and along with earthquakes. The three seem to go together. And when it comes to famines that we were talking about, I can assure you this, that in this country and in the Western world, we don't understand what it means to go to bed starving. In fact, many of us here in the Western world, we have a problem the other way. But I can tell you they don't have weight loss classes in India and some of those countries, and in Africa, where people can hardly get any food. If they get a little food, 1 meal per day, they're doing very, very well. If you've been watching what's happening in northern Africa like Sudan and so forth, terrible things. I mean, it's just any parent that has a child and sees those poor mothers with their little children dying in their arms. Just imagine the feelings that are going through those poor people's hearts. And that's not just happening in one case, that's happening millions. And we live in such a wonderful country, we feel immune, we don't even feel part of that same world. But anyone who's travelled around the world knows that famines, the lack of food for a large percentage of the world's population today is something which is tragic. Tragic. Then Jesus went on to say in Matthew 24, and made a statement in verse 15. I want you to notice what Jesus said here in Matthew 24, verse 15. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, Matthew adds, whoever reads, let him understand. Now, it's interesting that Jesus here nominated in his discussion about the second coming and the signs, which particular prophet did Jesus say we ought to study and understand? Daniel the prophet. And yet the tragedy is Daniel is a prophet that's hardly ever referred to by Christians. Hardly know anything about Daniel. And yet Jesus said, study and understand it. Because in the context of his second coming, Daniel has a lot to say. Let me just give you an illustration. Come back to Daniel chapter 12. Daniel chapter 12, and you've got the page there. Daniel, the 12th chapter, and verse 4. Daniel chapter 12 and verse 4. And here Daniel is writing about these times, and this is what he said. But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until when? The time of the end. Now let me illustrate. Here on the screen we have the end of time. Now the end of time is when Jesus is going to come back. But the time of the end is that little period of time just before he returns. Can you see there the time of the end? And Jesus is saying through Daniel that the book of Daniel was going to be sealed up, that is, people wouldn't understand it. It would be sealed from understanding, sealed up until the time of the end. As I said, the time of the end is not the end of time. The end of time is when Jesus returns. But the period just before he comes back is known as the time of the end. Now, how will we know when the time of the end begins? Well, verse 4 goes on to say, many shall run to and fro, and what's going to increase? Knowledge is going to increase. One of the great signs that we're living in the time of the end is going to be an explosion in knowledge. Tell me, do we live in such a world today? Are we seeing an explosion in knowledge today? Why, oh my. Anyone who would think otherwise would be an ostrich and have their head in the sand. And we've all experienced it with children at school. You know, you spend large numbers of dollars on textbooks for your children. You say to the kids, now listen, you look after that textbook, because when Mary comes along into the same class, she can have the book, and we don't have to buy it a second time. And what happens when Mary gets to that same class? Their textbook's out of date, particularly in the sciences. Because science is changing, you know. You never need to worry about what science is today. What science is today and what science is tomorrow will probably be two different things. Pick up the magazine recently, a little article that was written in 1850, and it said 50 reasons why a scientist could not believe in God. 50 reasons. There wouldn't be one scientist in the world today who would agree with any one of those 50. And yet, if you followed science back in 1850, you couldn't believe in God because of what science was saying. Wow, science. You see, to know anything really for sure, you've got to know everything, isn't that right? That's true, isn't it? To be absolutely certain about anything, you have to know everything. Because otherwise there might be a little bit of knowledge out here that you don't know, which would completely change your conclusions if you knew about it. Get the thought? Now, which scientist in the world would like to claim that they know everything about even their own discipline? There's none. That's why every scientist ought to be the most humble person in the world, not making dogmatic statements about anything, because he or she is in a discipline that is changing like a chameleon with its skin every day. New knowledge is coming to pass because we're understanding more about the universe. And the time of the end, knowledge is going to explode. Take computers. Amazing world in which we live. God said that this would be a great sign of the end of the world. You know, air travel. Air travel is an amazing thing too. I mean, we take it for granted so much today. It's only over 100 years ago that men were able to fly. In the First World War, aeroplanes flew at 67 kilometres an hour. Now, most of you travel faster to get to the meeting than they flew in the First World War. And today they're getting faster and faster and faster. You know, I heard about a lady over there in Sydney. She wanted to come over here to Perth. And she rang up Qantas because she wanted to find out how long will it take to fly from one part of Australia to the other. Now, you all know that flying from one way is different to flying the other way, isn't that right? When you fly from Sydney to Perth, that is, you fly from east to west, it takes you longer than flying from west to east. Because when you fly west to east, you've got the tailwinds usually, and if it's a good tailwind, it could cut off half an hour, 3/4 of an hour off a 4-hour journey. And so when she rang up Qantas, she said, how long will it take me to fly over? Well, the air clerk wasn't quite certain. And so he said to the lady, just a minute. Thank you, said the lady, and she hung up. Now, we haven't got that fast yet, have we? But I want to tell you this, that we're going there in a big way. Because God said that knowledge is going to dramatically increase. And we're seeing that today. A blind man would see it. People say to me, well, Daniel must have been a pretty smart man to be able to work all this out. I don't think that he is much smarter than any of us. Because look, notice what he said here in Daniel 12. You've still got it open, have you? Daniel 12 and verse 6. Verse 6. And one said to the man clothed in linen who was above the waters of the river, how long shall the fulfillment of these wonders be? How long is it going to be until all these things take place? Notice the answer. Verse 8. Although I heard, I did not what? Understand. So did Daniel understand what he was writing? No, he didn't. He admitted that. But you see, Daniel wrote down what God told him. And that's why when you read the Bible today, it doesn't sound like a book that was written 2,500 years ago when Daniel lived. You know, you pick up another book that was written 2,500 years ago, it wouldn't sound very up to date, would it? It would reflect the thinking of the times, but not the Bible. Because the Bible was written by someone who knows the end from the beginning and has written it down so that when we read it today, it sounds, well, pretty up to date. Sounds as if it could have been written just in the last year or two. because God can see the end from the beginning. And although Daniel didn't understand, he still wrote down exactly what God told him. That's why we can have tremendous confidence in this book. Now I want to look at signs in the economic world. Just come over to the book of James, toward the back of the Bible. Right over toward the back, the book of James. And we will read here chapter 5. James chapter 5. After Hebrews comes James, the 5th chapter, page 1161, and this is what it says. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you. Now, we don't often associate the rich weeping and howling, but here James is saying the rich are going to weep and howl for their miseries. All right? Why? Verse 2. Your riches are corrupted and your garments are moth-eaten. Now, we all understand that language. You know, if you've had your good suit or your good dress hanging up in the wardrobe and you haven't worn it for a while, and you find when you go to put it on that the silverfish or the moths have been into it, not a nice feeling, is it? Ruined it. And that's how the Bible is describing the rich are going to regard their riches. They're going to be moth-eaten, useless. Verse 3, your gold and silver are corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have heaped up treasure in the last days. So the Bible is saying there's going to be a great accumulation of wealth in the last days. By the way, are we seeing that today? Even in this part of the world, I understand that things are on a pretty good roll. Riches are increasing. But then notice what the Bible talks about, verse 4. Indeed, the wages of the labourers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out. And the cries of the reapers have reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. You have lived on the earth in pleasure and luxury, that is talking about the rich. You have fattened your hearts as in a day of slaughter. You have condemned, you have murdered the just. He does not resist. Therefore be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit on the earth, waiting patiently for it until it receives the early and the latter rain. You also be patient, establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. What is James talking about here? He's saying there's going to be great conflict between two groups of people in the last days. First of all, there's going to be a great accumulation of wealth, and eventually that wealth is going to be regarded as worthless. It's like the moths have got into the garments, and the gold and the silver have become corroded. They're going to become worthless. At the same time that that's going to take place, then we find this other class of people, the labourers who have worked, have been diddled out of their money. They haven't had a fair share. And there's going to be these two groups of people. Now, the Bible is not taking sides and saying it's the labourers against the capitalist and one's right and the other's wrong. That's not what the Bible is saying. All the Bible is saying is that there's going to be two groups of people. And they're going to be in conflict. And once again, I don't need to remind you of the conflict that is often waged between those who are regarded as the capitalists and those who are regarded as the labourers or the unionists. God said that there's going to be problems between capital and labour, and once again that this is going to be a sign of Jesus coming. God says, be patient. Don't lose your confidence now as you see this taking place, because the coming of the Lord is about to take place. Establish your hearts. Be confident. Then Jesus talked about the fifth sign that I want to underline. Come back to Matthew chapter 24 again, Matthew the 24th chapter. And it's page 961, Matthew 24. And this time, verse 36. I think we'll start with verse 36, or perhaps verse 37. Maybe we better start with verse 37. Jesus said, as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. So Jesus says, as it was in the days of Noah, it's going to be a mirror image of the days just before Jesus returns. Is that what he's saying? Exactly. So if we go back now to the days of Noah, and when we think of Noah, we've got to go right back to the beginning. And we go back to Genesis chapter 6, right at the very beginning. Genesis chapter 6 and verse 1, page 5, right at the very beginning. As it was in the days of Noah, so it's going to be in the days of the coming of the Son of Man. All right? What were conditions like just before the flood? Have a look at verse 1. Now it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. This would suggest that there was a tremendous increase in the population just before the flood. Some estimate the population of the world before the flood was very, very high, extremely high. And it seems from the statement that's made here, they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose, that this is referring to polygamy. Well, you say we don't have polygamy today. Well, no, that's true, we don't have polygamy, but maybe if it was not against the law, we might. But we have what is something very similar in today's world. It's called easy divorce, in which instead of having many at the one time, we have a string of them. In fact, it's interesting that in 1870 there was one divorce for every 34 marriages. Do you know what it is today? Nearly, not quite, but nearly one in every two. So I tell young couples when they're about to get married, your chance is only 50%. That's what the law of averages says, 50%, that you're going to survive a number of years. And of course, this has tremendous repercussions in our society today, because anybody who's been through a divorce knows the sadness and the interruption of life that takes upon, and the toll that takes upon a person. You know, in Britain today and in Australia it's not much different. Nearly 30% of births are outside marriages. 30%. And if we read on here in Genesis chapter 6, we read a description describing the conditions in the world just before the flood. Notice what they were in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 11. The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with what? Violence. Two words describe the antediluvian world. One was corrupt and violent. Tell me, would that describe our world today? I don't have to prove that to anybody. Nobody will doubt that. Corrupt and violent. Why, you say, you couldn't describe our world better than that? Today we can hardly trust anybody. In fact, the very people that have been in our society who we should look up to today have let us all down. And we have politicians in which corruption is just rife with. And I believe that if there's one thing that has contributed to both corruption and violence in our society today more than any other single thing, it is what has churned out of Hollywood. That is influencing our society like nothing else on this earth. Because people are spending more and more time watching rather than reading any longer. Fewer and fewer people are reading because they're spending all their spare time in watching television or going to the theatre or videos or whatever it might happen to be. And what is being churned out from Hollywood today is influencing our society in a very, very marked way. Let me just give you some evidence of that. Back in 1981, now that's a long time ago, two researchers, Joyce Sprafkin and Teresa Silverman, monitored 58 programs on prime-time television. Now, prime-time television is the time between 6 and 10 at night when everybody, the families, are watching. All right? Prime time. They monitored 58 programs in prime-time television. They found this: 41 instances of sex outside marriage, and only 6 between married people. 41 outside marriage, 6 inside marriage. 41 to 6. All right? What is it today? Well, the extramarital sex has dramatically increased. From April 28 the other year to May 25, they logged 615 instances of sexual activity depicted or discussed on prime time television. We're not talking about late night television, I'm talking about prime time television. A ratio of 571 to 44, a ratio of 13 to 1, favouring sex outside marriage. Now, what's that saying? What's the message that is coming through to young people, to impressionable young people particularly? What's the message? That's life. That's what you do. In fact, if a girl by the age of 21, the pressure seems to be that if a girl hasn't experimented and so forth, by the age of 21 there's something wrong with her. That's the impression that's gained as you watch television. Now, I don't believe that that is the case in real life, but that would be the impression that you get when you watch the media. 571 to 13. Hollywood is telling us that there is no fun without sin. No kiss except a stolen one. Let me tell you about Silence of the Lambs. Now, once again, this is an oldie, a few years ago now. The reason I still mention it is because it is only the third film in history to win all the major awards. Best screenplay, best director, best actor, best actress, best director. It won the lot. It's only the third film in history to ever do that. Now, what was Silence of the Lambs about? Well, let me read you what a film critic said. The plot of Silence of the Lambs centres on a transvestite serial killer who stuffs the larvae of a rare moth down the throats of his victims after he has skinned them. He selects overweight women as the targets of his wrath, holding them prisoner and starving them for a time before slaughtering them so that their skin will hang loose on their frames. The criminals are so bizarre and extreme in their sadistic pleasures that they are more ridiculous than frightening. Now, remember, that's the film that won all the awards. The third in history to ever do that. And it's about that. I tell you, friend, I refuse to go along and waste my time and money on some perverted director or writer who has written a script like that, that does not reflect where the vast majority of human beings are, Christian or non-Christian. That's not where the majority are, but the trouble is we sit back and we absorb and we watch that dribble out of a sick mind. And then could I mention about violence? Since 1955, TV characters have been murdered 1,000 more than happens in real life. And a normal night's viewing, according to Rothman, Litcher and Litcher, report that you would see 15 to 20 robberies, rapes, assaults and other crimes. And then today, could I remind you about the rise of AIDS in some African countries? Nearly 25% of the population, South Africa when I was there recently, 25% of the population is HIV positive. Huge amount. Population numbers are being rolled back because of the fact that so many people are dying. Magic Johnson, remember him? The great basketball player, made a shocking disclosure after admitting that he'd had woman after woman after woman. He said, I thought my body could handle it, but I've discovered that even Magic Johnson is subject to the laws of nature, because you'll remember that he was HIV positive. A last verse. I want to end on something positive. Luke chapter 21. Just come over there, because while there's lots of negativity in the world, the Bible ends on a positive note, and I want to read it what it says. Luke 21 and verse 25, 26, we read men's hearts failing them from fear. It says in verse 27, then they will see, this is Luke 21 verse 27, then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now when these things begin to happen, what are we to do? Look up and lift up our heads, because our redemption draws nigh. When we see all these things happening in the world today, what are we to do? Become terribly frightened and discouraged? No, we're not to be discouraged. Our note is of confidence, because Jesus said all these things must take place, and as you see them taking place, take fresh courage, look up, because Jesus is about to return. And I want to remind you of a message of hope, because Jesus has told us these things not to frighten us, but because he loves us. Listen, if I knew that your house was going to burn down in the next 12 months, and you knew that I knew, you had confidence that I was right, that your house was going to burn down in the next 12 months, would you want me to tell you that, or would you not? Would you want me to tell you? Why would you want me to tell you? Yes, so that you could be prepared, isn't that right? You might want to make sure your insurance was up to date. Huh? That's the first thing you do. You might want to take out your pictures, your family pictures that are valuable to you, that you can never replace. You'd be able to make preparation, right? That's why Jesus has told us these things. Not to frighten us, but so that we can be prepared. Because whether we believe it or not, Jesus is coming. We have read evidence after evidence, and there's far more, and I'm going to share with you night by night more evidence that the Bible is true. And as we see these things taking place today, it gives us fresh confidence that the book that has been the solace of so many down through the years is true, and that we can trust it. And today, in these last times, God wants us to be ready. And I tell you this, in my heart of hearts, I want to be ready when Jesus comes. In fact, I'd like to raise my hand to God and say, God, help me to be ready when you come. Who'd like to join me and say, I want to be ready? Yes, God bless you. Because as we make a decision to follow Jesus, then we can be ready. Let's just bow our heads together in prayer. Our wonderful Father in heaven, I just want to thank you again at this very time for all the signs that you have told us about. Signs that tell us in the heavens and on the earth that Jesus is coming soon, and we want to be ready. You have told us because you love us, that you don't want us to be lost. You want us to understand the times in which we live. And so I pray today that you will bless us now as we go home. We want to be ready, and bring us back again tomorrow night as further we look into these wonderful, wonderful truths. I pray for Jesus' sake.